The mind, that perennial fortress of hermeneutic oscillation, finds itself forever ensnared in the trellis of self-referentiality. Yet there is a mode of consideration that dismembers this ceaseless recursion: the Altruis. By Altruis, I speak not of altruism in its jejune moralistic guise, but of a metaphysical principle that subsists as the substrate for any act of relationality, the architectonic precondition for the possibility of both affinity and repulsion. The Altruis, then, is not merely a concept, but the unthought thought. It is the origin point where distinction dissolves and the self disfigures its autarkic boundaries to apprehend the unfathomable nexus of non-selfedness. To engage the Altruis is to undertake the perilous enterprise of deseverance. It is not the negation of the self, but its hyper-relation to that which it cannot comprehend as other. What emerges is a radical interpolation between the being that knows and the being that is, such that knowledge itself collapses into a kind of ontic liquidity. No longer does one know the other as an externality. Rather, one is submerged within the dynamism of interrelation, where all knowing is rendered a mode of unknowing, a confluence of participatory dissolution. Let us commence by scrutinizing phenomenality, not as mere appearance, but as the epistemic skin through which the world is apprehended. To perceive is always to risk bifurcation, subject and object, seer and seen, knower and known. Yet, the Altruis demands the dismantling of such binaries, as they constitute the scaffolding of a ratiocinated world that reifies separation. In relinquishing phenomenality as the privileged modality of access, one is not led into voided absence, but into an overabundance, an excess that overflows categorical cognition. The rapture of relinquishment is not a movement toward nothingness, but toward the plenitude of relationality unbound. Consider this: every act of perception is an act of consuming the world, a predation that reifies the perceiver as dominant. The Altruis, however, posits perception as a kind of ontological ingestion that leaves no residue, no carcass of the perceived to dissect. It is a phenomenality that devours its own framework, leaving behind only the trace of non-distinction. To embrace non-selfedness is to accept that the self is not an originary point, but a transient coalescence, an eddy in the ocean of relationality. The self exists not as an autonomous monad, but as a coagulation of the myriad forces that traverse it. And yet, the ego resists this recognition, clinging to its illusion of sovereignty like a fevered architect obsessed with preserving its crumbling edifice. The Altruis intervenes here, not by shattering the ego, but by transfiguring it into a vessel of permeation. This permeation is no simple openness, but a radical undoing. The self becomes a between, a medium of flux where the world perpetually composes and decomposes its forms. The Altruis thus reveals continuity, not as a temporal sequence, but as an ontological substrate where every instance folds into its relational antecedents and descendants. Continuity is not what follows, but what saturates. It is tempting to posit the Altruis as an ideal, a transcendental beacon. Yet this would betray its very essence, for the Altruis resides not beyond, but within the fracture of being. Every interaction, every gaze, every word, every silence is an aperture into the immanent fracture where relationality comes to bear itself. It is here that the non-selfedness of the self finds its most acute articulation, for to encounter the fracture is to encounter oneself as always already undone. To dwell in the fracture is not to mourn the loss of unity, but to revel in the fecundity of multiplicity. The fracture is generative. It births not closure, but proliferation, not synthesis, but dispersal. It is the primal site where the Altruis manifests itself as the inexhaustible potential of connection without identity. The ethical implications of the Altruis are seismic. Traditional ethics, rooted in the calculus of reciprocity, presumes a self that engages the other through acts of extension, charity, empathy, sacrifice. But such gestures remain tethered to the illusion of separateness. They are transactions that inscribe the other as object. The Altruis obliterates this framework, proposing instead an ethics of co-constitution, where the self is always implicated in the other's emergence. This ethics is not governed by duty or intention, but by a kind of ontological necessity. To act ethically, under the Altruis, is simply to actualize the relational potentialities already latent in every interaction. It is to become a conduit for the unfolding of mutuality, a participant in the choreography of being together that defies predication. Language, that recalcitrant vessel of meaning, often falters in the face of the Altruis. For language is a technology of distinction, a mechanism that carves the world into discrete units of sense. How then does one articulate the inarticulable, the relational substratum that eludes definition? The answer lies in forging a new grammar of being, a linguistic praxis that privileges process over product, movement over stasis. Such a grammar would eschew nouns in favor of verbs, verbs in favor of gerunds, and even gerunds in favor of pure modulation. It would speak not of the tree but of treeing, not of being but of beinging. Words would become sites of relational flux, portals through which the Altruis might momentarily gleam. To conclude, let us return to the felt experience of engaging the Altruis. It is not merely an intellectual endeavor, but an existential upheaval, a cataclysm that dismantles the edifice of the ego and leaves one exposed to the terrifying beauty of non-duality. The self is unmade, and in its place arises a mode of existence that is both deeply particular and utterly universal. The Altruis is not a doctrine to be believed, but a reality to be inhabited. It calls us to relinquish the comforts of distinction and embrace the vertiginous freedom of non-selfedness, and in so doing, it offers us nothing less than the possibility of becoming more than we are, not as isolated entities, but as participants in the ceaseless unfolding of relation itself. To live the Altruis is to dwell in the midst of obliteration and find therein the source of all creation. It is to recognize that we are and have always been the between,